The year 2026 does not arrive with a siren. There is no single date circled in red on a global calendar. No universal announcement. No moment when the world collectively looks up and agrees that something has shifted. Cities stay lit. Screens stay bright. Markets open and close. Algorithms continue learning. On the surface, the machine keeps running. Yet if you pause long enough, just long enough to feel rather than analyze, you may notice something subtle. Not a crisis in the usual sense. Not panic. Not collapse. More like fatigue. A quiet, spreading tiredness that does not belong to one country, one industry, or one political moment. It feels closer to the hum of a machine that has been operating without rest for far too long. Not breaking, just straining. Metal expanding from heat accumulated over decades. Many will call this moment a crisis, an energy crisis, an economic crisis, a mental health crisis. But those labels may miss the deeper pattern. What if this is not a crisis at all, but the final phase of fuel depletion? What if 2026 is not about something going wrong, but about something finishing? Imagine a vehicle that has been driving for centuries. Not an ordinary vehicle, but a vast construct we call modern civilization. It has been powered by assumptions so deeply embedded we rarely question them. That growth can be infinite. That technology will always fix what it disrupts. That tomorrow must be bigger, faster, and more efficient than today. For a very long time, that engine ran smoothly. It carried us across oceans of possibility. It built cities, networks, and systems beyond anything our ancestors could have imagined. In 2026, the vehicle is still moving, but the fuel gauge is no longer full. You can sense this not through headlines, but through tone, through the way conversations have changed. Those who once spoke with certainty now speak with caution. The language of inevitability has softened into the language of probability. Maybe it's possible, we'll see. Even the most optimistic projections now carry an undertone of restraint, as if something unseen is quietly applying pressure from beneath. This is how cycles end. They do not collapse overnight. They do not announce themselves. They stretch. They strain. They demand more energy to produce the same results. And eventually, they begin consuming themselves just to keep moving. History is filled with moments like this. Civilizations do not vanish in a single act of destruction. They persist long past their peak, adapting, reorganizing, extending their lifespan through ingenuity and force of will. The people living inside those moments rarely know they are standing at the edge of a transition. They simply feel that life has become heavier, more complex, less rewarding. The unique quality of 2026 is not drama. It is quiet recognition. It is the final year of a cycle still running on momentum. A year in which the old systems function not because they are being renewed, but because they have not yet fully stopped. Like a car coasting forward after the fuel line has been cut, moving only because of inertia. You can feel this in the way effort is distributed. More energy is required just to maintain what already exists. Entire industries work tirelessly to preserve structures that no longer generate genuine vitality. The work becomes defensive rather than creative. Maintenance replaces imagination. And this pattern is not limited to institutions. It appears in individual lives as well. You may notice it in yourself. Habits that once felt purposeful now feel obligatory. Goals that once energized you now feel strangely hollow. You may not be failing. You may not be lost. It may simply be that the fuel for an older version of your life is running low. This is an uncomfortable realization for a culture built on acceleration. We are trained to respond to resistance by pushing harder, optimizing further, extracting more efficiency from systems already stretched thin. But cycles do not respond to pressure. They respond to timing. When a cycle is complete, no amount of effort can restart it in the same form. That does not mean something is wrong. It means something is changing. In 2026, the world still appears functional. The lights are on. The infrastructure holds. Yet beneath that stability lies a quiet truth. The energy that sustained this particular way of organizing reality is being withdrawn. Not violently, not maliciously, simply as part of a larger rhythm that has repeated throughout human history. This is why the year feels strange to so many people, even if they cannot explain why. It is not fear they are sensing. It is the absence of renewal. The subtle understanding that what carried us here may not carry us much further. And perhaps that understanding is not meant to alarm us. Perhaps it is meant to slow us down. Before any great transition, there is always a moment of stillness. A pause in which observation matters more than action. A space where awareness begins to replace momentum. 2026 occupies that space. It is not the collapse. It is not the rebirth. It is the threshold. Nothing needs to be decided yet. The task of this year may be as simple and as difficult as noticing where energy is leaking, where effort is being spent to uphold stories that no longer nourish us, where we are driving forward not because the road is alive, but because stopping feels unfamiliar. Cycles do not ask for permission to end. They only ask to be recognized. And recognition is often the first quiet step toward whatever comes next. The machine is still running, but the fuel is no longer infinite. Long before anyone noticed the numbers, there were stories. Sailors once believed the edge of the world could be reached if you traveled far enough. Ancient skywatchers tracked lights that appeared, vanished, and returned generations later, leaving no explanation behind lee patterns. Every civilization has carried its own language for the same intuition, that the universe does not move in straight lines, and that change often arrives disguised as mystery. In recent years, attention has returned to the sky not with fear, but with curiosity. Reports of unfamiliar objects, data points that don't quite fit existing models. Names are assigned quickly, almost reflexively, as if labeling something makes it less unsettling. Atlas, interstellar visitor, cosmic anomaly. But beneath the terminology lies something older than science itself. The sense that something is passing through, not crashing into us, not attacking, just moving through. The metaphor that has emerged is not one of destruction, but of cleaning. A broom sweeping quietly through a long-occupied room, dust lifted, corners exposed, space cleared. It is tempting to interpret such imagery literally, to imagine a physical object causing a physical outcome. But cycles rarely work that way. They operate symbolically first, materially second. What matters is not the object itself, but what it represents in the human psyche at this particular moment in time. Think about how cleaning actually works. A cleaner does not destroy a house. It does not tear down the walls or collapse the structure. It removes what no longer belongs, what has accumulated unnoticed. Dust that once felt invisible. Clutter that built up gradually, item by item, year by year, until movement itself became difficult. The discomfort comes not from the act of cleaning, but from what it reveals. Every swept floor exposes what was hidden beneath furniture. Every cleared surface forces a decision. Keep this or let it go. Cleaning creates space, but space can feel unsettling to those accustomed to fullness. This is why the image of a cosmic broom resonates now. It mirrors what many people are experiencing internally. Not catastrophe, but exposure. Not annihilation, but subtraction. When something moves through a system without attachment, it does not negotiate. It does not explain itself. It simply passes, leaving the system changed not because it added something new, but because it removed what could no longer stay. This is how large transitions often begin, not with fire, but with emptiness. The fear many people feel around this moment does not come from loss itself. It comes from uncertainty about what fills the space afterward. We are comfortable with growth. We are less comfortable with clearing. Yet no new structure has ever emerged without first making room. History offers countless examples. Periods of apparent decline often coincide with unseen preparation. The collapse of one narrative creates silence. In that silence, new ways of being quietly take shape. But from inside the transition, it never feels elegant. It feels disorienting. The idea of Atlas sweeping through does not need to be literal to be meaningful. It functions as a mirror, a reminder that something larger than our current systems is in motion. That whatever has been overbuilt, overextended, or artificially sustained may soon find itself unsupported. And this is where interpretation matters. If you believe the broom is here to punish, you brace for impact. You cling tighter to what you know. You try to protect every possession, every identity, every assumption. But if you understand the broom as neutral, neither benevolent nor malicious, then its movement becomes informative rather than threatening. It tells you where stagnation has set in. It shows you what has accumulated beyond usefulness. It reveals which structures depend entirely on constant force to remain upright. A system that cannot tolerate cleaning was never stable to begin with. This applies not only to institutions, but to individuals. When something passes through your life and removes what no longer fits, the instinct is to resist, to rebuild immediately, to refill the space as quickly as possible. Yet the space itself carries information. It asks a question before offering an answer. What would grow here if nothing rushed in? The reason this moment feels uncanny is because it interrupts momentum. Modern culture is built on uninterrupted motion, continuous output, continuous consumption, continuous explanation. A sweeping force, cosmic or symbolic, disrupts that flow. It introduces pause. Pause is deeply uncomfortable for systems that depend on speed, and yet pause is where reorganization begins. The broom does not stay. It never does. Cleaners are always temporary. They move through quietly, often unnoticed, and then they are gone. What remains is not the broom, but the room after it passes. A room feels different when it has been cleared. Sound changes. Light moves differently. Even the air feels altered. That change can feel unsettling at first, especially if clutter once provided a sense of security. But it also creates possibility. This is why the narrative of destruction misses the point. Nothing essential is being taken. Only what was already decaying, already obsolete, already draining energy without giving life back in return. The sweep is not aimed at humanity, it is aimed at excess, at distortion, at structures built beyond their natural lifespan. What follows is not immediate clarity, it is space. And space invites choice. Do you rush to refill it with the same patterns? Or do you sit with it long enough to sense what wants to emerge? The deeper message of this moment is not about an object in the sky. It is about readiness, about the willingness to let go of arrangements that once served a purpose but now require constant maintenance just to exist. When something sweeps through your life quietly, impersonally, it is rarely asking you to fight. It is asking you to notice. Notice what feels lighter after it passes. Notice what no longer needs defending. Notice what you were holding simply because it was familiar. The sweep does not announce the future. It clears the ground for it. And in that clearing, before anything new takes shape, there is a brief, rare silence. A silence where momentum loosens its grip. A silence where you are no longer being pushed forward by habit alone. That silence is not empty. It is fertile. There is a story humanity has repeated for a very long time. It is the story of being acted upon, of forces arriving from the outside gods, fate, history, systems, enemies, and shaping our lives without our consent. In this story, people endure. They survive, they adapt, but they rarely choose. They are passengers more than participants. This narrative has served a purpose. It helped early civilizations make sense of chaos. It offered meaning in times when control was limited and survival uncertain. But every story, like every system, eventually reaches the limits of its usefulness. Something subtle has begun to shift. You can feel it in the way the word victim has started to lose its power. Not because suffering has disappeared, but because the identity of being powerless no longer feels sustainable. It drains energy. It fragments communities. It keeps attention locked on blame rather than movement. This is where the deeper layer of the current cycle emerges. Gene Key 55 speaks of victimization not as an external condition, but as an internal frequency. A way of perceiving reality in which life is something that happens to you rather than through you. It is not an accusation, it is an observation. And every observation carries the possibility of change. When a cycle based on victimhood runs out of fuel, the shift that follows is not dramatic. It is intimate. Freedom, in this context, is not political. It is perceptual. It is the moment you realize that the story you have been telling about yourself is no longer the only one available. That you are not required to carry an identity simply because it once helped you survive. But freedom alone is unstable. This is where Gene Key 59 enters the picture, not as an abstract concept, but as a counterbalance. Intimacy, transparency. The willingness to be seen without armor. The willingness to connect without manipulation. These qualities do not emerge in cultures driven by speed and efficiency. They emerge when something slows enough to allow proximity. The end of a victim narrative does not create isolation. It creates closeness. History offers a strange confirmation of this pattern. When large systems begin to dissolve, people do not immediately become independent heroes. They form smaller units, villages, circles, alliances based on trust rather than hierarchy. Intimacy becomes a survival strategy, not a luxury. What is changing now is not merely belief, but biology. Long-held stress patterns begin to soften when the body no longer expects constant threat. The nervous system, conditioned for vigilance, begins to recalibrate. This is not something you decide intellectually. It happens gradually, as the old story loses relevance. You may notice this shift in moments when defensiveness feels exhausting, when proving yourself feels pointless, when transparency feels safer than performance. These are not personal failures. They are signs that a collective frequency is losing momentum. Victimhood requires an enemy. Intimacy requires presence. The reason this transition feels challenging is because it asks for something unfamiliar. Responsibility without blame. Agency without domination. Connection without control. These are not skills most modern systems have trained us to develop. And yet, they emerge naturally when the old incentives collapse. In previous cycles, power flowed upward. Information was controlled. Distance preserved authority. But in a system where energy is scarce, complexity becomes a liability. Layers are removed. Directness becomes efficient. Honesty becomes practical. This is why transparency feels inevitable now, not as a moral demand, but as a structural necessity. Hidden agendas require too much energy to maintain. Fragmentation becomes costly. The system favors coherence. On a personal level, this can feel deeply uncomfortable. When the victim's story ends, there is no one left to carry the weight for you. No abstract force to blame. No external savior to wait for. At first, this can feel like loss, but it is also the return of choice. Choice to respond rather than react. Choice to connect rather than withdraw. Choice to participate rather than endure. Intimacy, in this sense, is not romantic, it is systemic. It is the ability of parts to communicate without distortion. In biology, this is health. In societies, it is resilience. In individuals, it is peace. This is why the shift from victimization to freedom is inseparable from the shift from dishonesty to intimacy. One cannot exist without the other. Freedom without intimacy becomes isolation. Intimacy without freedom becomes dependence. Together, they form a new equilibrium. And this equilibrium does not announce itself loudly. It appears quietly in everyday interactions, in conversations that feel more real, in communities that feel less performative, in the growing discomfort with narratives that demand outrage but offer no resolution. The end of a cycle does not ask humanity to become something new overnight. It asks humanity to remember something old, something that existed before complexity hardened into identity, before systems replaced relationships. You may already sense this in your own life. A pull toward fewer but deeper connections, a preference for honesty over harmony, a desire to simplify not just possessions, but commitments. These impulses are not regressions. They are recalibrations. As the broader systems lose coherence, coherence becomes an internal resource, and intimacy is how coherence spreads. The world does not need more control in this moment. It needs more clarity, more alignment, more willingness to be present without pretense. When the victim's story fades, responsibility returns to its rightful place, not as burden, but as capacity. The capacity to respond creatively rather than defensively, to adapt without abandoning oneself, to meet others without masks. This is the quiet revolution of the cycle. No banners, no declarations, just a gradual release of an identity that has outlived its purpose, and in its place, something simpler begins to form. Not a new ideology, not a perfected system, but a different way of being with one another. For a long time, the future was imagined as something external, a new machine, a smarter system, an intelligence that would arrive from the outside and lift humanity beyond its limitations. This belief was not irrational. It was reinforced by centuries of visible progress. Tools became technologies. Technologies became networks. Networks became worlds. Each leap appeared to confirm the same assumption, that evolution moves outward, that salvation arrives through invention, that complexity equals advancement. But every belief, when carried far enough, reveals its blind spot. The idea that technology alone would carry humanity into its next chapter rests on a quiet expectation that the human being itself does not need to change, that we can place new intelligence on top of old nervous systems, new power into old emotional patterns, new speed into bodies already saturated with stress. This is where the narrative begins to bend, because what is unfolding now does not look like an external upgrade. It looks like an internal interruption. If you pay attention, you can sense it in the body before you can name it in the mind. A subtle rejection of constant stimulation, a wariness with optimization, a longing not for more information, but for coherence. These sensations are not philosophical. They are biological. The human system has limits. For decades, we have treated the body as a secondary concern, a vessel to be managed while attention lives elsewhere. But biology always speaks eventually. And when it does, it speaks through sensation, exhaustion, anxiety, and the quiet realization that speed is no longer sustainable. The shift now underway does not announce itself as a breakthrough. It emerges as friction. Friction between pace and capacity, between stimulus and integration, between what we are building and what we are able to embody. This is why the most significant changes of this period are largely invisible. They are not measured in productivity gains or processing power. They are measured in thresholds. How much stress a nervous system can carry before it must reorganize. How much complexity a mind can hold before it seeks simplicity. Biology adapts when pressure becomes chronic. This is not new. It is how life has always evolved. But what makes this moment unique is that the pressure is global, simultaneous, and internal. The stimulus does not come from predators or climate alone. It comes from information itself, from constant alertness, from perpetual comparison, from living inside systems that never sleep. Under these conditions, adaptation does not look like acceleration. It looks like regulation. You may notice this in your own rhythms. A growing sensitivity to noise, a desire for fewer inputs, a resistance to multitasking. These are not signs of weakness. They are signals of recalibration. The body knows when a pattern has exceeded its usefulness. What is often described as a mental health crisis may actually be a transitional response. The psyche, like any system, reacts when its environment changes faster than it can integrate. Anxiety increases when prediction becomes impossible. Burnout emerges when output is demanded without recovery. And recovery, in this context, is not rest in the traditional sense. It is reorganization. This is where the idea of an internal shift becomes crucial. The next phase of human evolution is unlikely to be driven by more external intelligence layered onto an unchanged organism. It is more likely to be driven by a change in how the organism itself processes reality. Less reactivity, more discernment, less fragmentation, more coherence. These qualities cannot be downloaded. They must be embodied. This is why the promise of artificial intelligence feels both exciting and unsettling. It mirrors our cognitive capacities without addressing our emotional and somatic ones. It can calculate, predict, and generate, but it cannot integrate sensation. It does not feel overload. It does not experience exhaustion. Humans do. As systems become more intelligent, the cost of remaining unconscious increases. Old coping strategies, avoidance, numbing, distraction, become less effective. The system demands presence. Presence is not a spiritual ideal here. It is a survival adaptation. A nervous system that cannot self-regulate, cannot navigate complexity. A mind that cannot pause, cannot perceive context. A body that is never allowed to rest, cannot sustain awareness. This is why the shift feels personal, even when it is global. Each individual encounters it through their own thresholds, through moments when pushing harder stops working, through realizations that no external solution can substitute for internal alignment. The change you cannot see is already happening. It happens when someone chooses depth over scale, when quality replaces quantity, when the question shifts from how fast to at what cost. These choices may appear small, but they are signals of a larger pattern asserting itself. Life does not optimize indefinitely. It cycles, it expands, then consolidates. It explores, then integrates. The era that emphasized expansion, more reach, more data, more speeds giving way to an era that emphasizes integration. Integration is quieter, less visible, but far more transformative. It alters how attention moves, how relationships form, how decisions are made, and most importantly, how the body relates to the world it inhabits. The future, in this sense, is not waiting to arrive. It is already pressing inward, asking for space, asking for regulation, asking for a pace that allows intelligence to live inside the body rather than hovering above it. This is not a retreat from progress. It is a refinement of it. The systems that cannot adapt to this internal shift will struggle not because they lack innovation, but because they lack coherence. And coherence begins at the level of biology, not ideology. As the outer world becomes increasingly complex, the inner world must become simpler to compensate. Not emptier, simpler, clearer, more aligned. This is the invisible transition of the current cycle. No announcement, no headline, just a growing recognition that the next evolution of humanity will not be built on top of us. It will be built through us. When large systems begin to lose coherence, the instinct is often to imagine replacement on the same scale. A new global structure, a new centralized solution, a redesigned version of what already exists. But cycles do not usually work that way. When energy withdraws from complexity, it does not flow into something equally complex. It flows downward, into smaller units, into simpler forms, into arrangements that require less maintenance to remain alive. This is why, after the sweep, what emerges does not resemble a grand new empire. It looks quieter, more local, more human. The future human does not live at the center of massive systems. They live at the edge of them, or entirely outside them. Not in opposition, but in indifference. They use technology where it serves life, and set it aside where it fragments attention. Tools return to their original role, support, not identity. Life reorganizes around proximity. Food comes from closer sources. Relationships form in smaller circles. Creativity becomes tactile again, hands, voices, shared space. Not because this is nostalgic, but because it is efficient in a low-fuel environment. Large systems collapse under their own weight when energy is scarce. Small systems adapt. This does not mean hardship disappears. Transitions are rarely comfortable. There will be moments of uncertainty, periods where the old structures no longer function as expected, and the new ones are not yet fully formed. This in-between space can feel unsettling, but it is also deeply clarifying. What matters becomes obvious. What drains energy reveals itself quickly. What is essential stands out without effort. The future human is not defined by what they accumulate, but by what they can let go of without losing themselves. Community becomes central not as ideology, but as biology. Humans regulate one another. Safety is shared. Intelligence moves through relationship rather than hierarchy. These are ancient patterns, resurfacing not because we failed, but because we have completed a cycle. Now the pace slows. This is not the moment to rush forward or cling backward. It is a moment to soften, to notice where life feels lighter when complexity falls away, to allow space to remain empty long enough for something honest to grow. Nothing needs to be forced. The sweep has already passed. The noise is settling. The ground is quieter now. And in that quiet, something gentle begins to form. A different rhythm, a different measure of success, a different understanding of what it means to be human. Not louder, not faster, just more real. Let the cycle turn.